There is one detail in the Nancy Guthrie investigation that investigators flagged above everything else in this case. Not the doorbell footage, not the ransom notes, not the DNA, not the Walmart backpack, not the utility box that blinded an entire neighborhood of cameras. Out of everything collected across weeks of intensive investigation, thousands of tips, hundreds of investigators, forensic analysis running simultaneously across multiple laboratories, there is one item that sits at the very top of the investigative file. A phone call made after the garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, 2026, between Nancy Guthrie and the last person to see her alive, and what investigators were listening for in that call, and what they heard, will change how you understand everything that happened in the 4 hours before her pacemaker went silent. Before we go anywhere with this, we need to be clear about something important. Law enforcement officially cleared the entire Guthrie family as suspects, including Tommaso Cioni, early in this investigation. What we are examining here is not guilt. It is the documented logic of the investigation, what the timeline shows, what the evidence indicates, and why this specific call became significant before that clearance was issued. We are not making accusations. We are following the facts, the publicly confirmed timeline, and the documented investigative focus that has been reported by credentialed journalists with direct sources in this case. Every individual referenced in this video is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. This is the verdict room. We examine the evidence, we follow the facts, and at the end of every investigation, we deliver the verdict. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Every single week, we go further than the headlines, bringing you the forensic analysis, the investigative detail, and the documented evidence that changes the way you understand these cases. If you are already part of this community, hit that like button right now. It helps more people find cases that deserve serious attention. Now let us start where this investigation actually starts. Not with the footage, not with the forensics, but with the person at the center of all of it. Nancy Long Guthrie had lived in Tucson for over 50 years. She knew every curve of those desert roads, the particular quality of light at dusk over the Catalina foothills, the way the neighborhood felt at different times of day. She had buried her husband decades ago, Charles, who died during a mining trip in Mexico in 1988, and she raised 3 children after that alone, without falling apart, without disappearing into grief. She kept going the way mothers do when there is no other option and no one else to do it. She became part of the fabric of that community in the way that quiet, steady people do over decades. She contributed to the University of Arizona's Journalism Advisory Council. She helped keep the state's poison information hotline alive in the 1990s when budget cuts threatened to shut it down. She walked the neighborhood with friends. She attended church every Sunday morning via live stream from her living room, a routine so reliable that when she didn't appear for the Sunday service, her friends noticed before the police did. She was expected, she was present, she was loved. Her 3 children, Annie, Cameron, and Savannah, the youngest, who would go on to become one of the most recognized faces on American television, grew up watching their mother hold things together. But to Nancy, Savannah was still just her daughter. The family stayed close, dinners regularly, board games afterward, matching pajamas at Christmas. The small rituals that families build without realizing how precious they are until they are gone. She was someone whose absence would be immediately felt by everyone around her, and she was taken. Saturday, January 31st, 2026 began like dozens of Saturdays before it. At 5:32 in the evening, Nancy ordered an Uber from her home in the Catalina foothills. The destination was roughly 4 miles away, her daughter Annie's house. A short ride through quiet residential streets she had traveled countless times, past the desert landscape and the soft glow of porch lights that define that part of Tucson. Dinner that evening was exactly what it sounds like. The family sat together and talked about everyday things, life, work, plans for the weeks ahead. Afterward, they played board games, a small tradition that had become part of how this family spent time together. There was no tension, no argument, no moment that anyone in that room would later point to and say something felt wrong. It was just a family evening, the kind that happens in homes across the country every single weekend. Annie's husband, Tommaso Cioni, had been part of this family since 2006. He taught advanced biology and 6th grade science at Basis Oro Valley, 15 years in the classroom, the kind of teacher students remember. Outside of school, he played bass guitar in a local band, wrote poetry in Italian, spent time studying reptiles and desert wildlife in the landscape he had called home for nearly 2 decades. Christmas photos taken just weeks before Nancy disappeared showed the whole family together in matching pajamas, Tommaso standing beside Nancy, holding the family dog, smiling. By every visible measure, a man completely at home inside this family. That detail matters, hold on to it. As the evening wound down, somewhere between 9:30 and 9:45, Tommaso offered to drive Nancy home. A few minutes along familiar streets. At 9:48 p.m., the garage door opened. At 9:50 p.m., it closed. Tommaso Cioni was the last known person to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive. He drove away. The house went quiet. And in that moment, that completely unremarkable moment, nobody felt a thing. It was just the end of a Saturday, the kind that families do not think about again until they have to. Now here is where the timeline enters territory that investigators marked as significant before anything else in this case. After Tommaso drove away, a phone call was made. The exact contents of that call have not been made public, but investigators confirmed it happened. They pulled it from the records. And in a case with thousands of tips, hundreds of investigators, and weeks of forensic analysis running simultaneously, they elevated that call above everything else in the timeline. Think about what that means operationally. Out of everything collected in this investigation, the doorbell footage, the ransom notes, the DNA evidence, the digital records, the utility box, the glove found 2 miles from the house, one phone call between Nancy Guthrie and her son-in-law in the final hours before she disappeared, sits at the top of the investigative file. What would investigators be listening for in a call like that? Whether Nancy sounded distressed, whether she mentioned anyone else, whether something in the tone felt fractionally off, whether there was background sound that did not belong, whether the conversation contained any detail inconsistent with what either party later said about the evening. In a case where the window of crime is measured in hours, the last known conversation becomes evidence in itself, not necessarily evidence of wrongdoing. A call can confirm that a person was alive and well at a specific point in time, which is itself forensically valuable. But the timestamp matters more than almost anything else in a case like this. Because within hours of that call, everything around Nancy Guthrie's home began to go dark. Investigators call it the window. The 4 hours between the moment that garage door closed and the moment Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting. 4 hours in a quiet desert neighborhood where nothing was supposed to happen. 4 hours that remain, even now, the most carefully analyzed stretch of time in this entire investigation. Let us think carefully about what 4 hours means operationally in the context of this specific neighborhood. Via Entrada, the road that runs through and around Nancy's neighborhood, is a road that reporters covering this case on the ground have described as like a maze at night. No street lights, impossible to read the street signs in the dark. A road that rewards prior knowledge and punishes strangers. A road that someone navigating confidently at 2 in the morning has already navigated before, in daylight, enough times to have its turns and its landmarks memorized in the body rather than the mind. The 4-hour window between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m. is not 4 hours of darkness. It is 4 hours that include the time required to depart, allow the neighborhood to settle into the stillness of late-night residential quiet, prepare, return, and execute with the level of precision the evidence reflects. 4 hours during which, according to the public record, no confirmed alibi for anyone involved in the final moments of that evening has been publicly verified. 4 hours is a long time. It is also enough time to account for every practical requirement of what the evidence shows happened that night. The approach, the disabling of the cameras, the 41 minutes of documented presence inside the residence, and the departure along a route that took the individual past the field where a glove was found 2 miles from the house. The question investigators were working from in those early days, before the clearance, before the public announcements, before the investigative focus shifted to the external suspect profile, was the question that the timeline itself demands. Who had the knowledge, the access, and the 4-hour window to have done this? And what does the phone call at the end of the evening tell us about the state of mind of the last person to see Nancy alive? After 9:50 p.m., there were no outgoing calls from Nancy's phone, no messages sent, no signs she tried to reach anyone. For hours, the digital record around her house was still. Then at 1:47 in the morning, Nancy's Google Nest doorbell camera disconnected. On its own, that might mean nothing. Devices lose signal, connections drop. But investigators do not get to decide something means nothing. Not in a case like this. They flag it. They add it to the timeline. They keep going. 25 minutes later, at 2:12 a.m., one of the home's motion detection systems recorded activity outside the property. That alert should have triggered a saved video clip. But Nancy had never subscribed to the paid Nest service that stores footage automatically. The system detected movement and preserved nothing. For investigators hoping to see what was happening outside that house in the middle of the night, the camera saw it and they never would. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker stopped sending data to the monitoring application connected to her phone. That device was designed to transmit health information continuously, allowing doctors to track her heart remotely. The signal went silent. When deputies finally entered the home, they found her phone sitting exactly where she had left it, on the counter inside the house. Her wallet beside it, her car keys, her daily heart medication, all of it where it belonged. None of it where it should be if Nancy had left voluntarily. Sheriff Chris Nano stated that investigators did not believe Nancy had simply walked away. The evidence indicated she had been taken. But there was something else. Something that reframed the entire night and pointed toward a level of planning that nobody had initially anticipated. Investigators discovered a damaged utility box located around the corner from Nancy's home, potentially connected to a reported internet outage that disrupted nearby surveillance cameras around the exact time she disappeared. When FBI agents and sheriff's deputies canvassed the neighborhood door to door, multiple homeowners confirmed they had experienced internet connectivity issues that same night. The Ring cameras that line residential streets in the Catalina foothills, cameras that residents rely on to document everything from package deliveries to coyotes crossing the yard, went dark. Not one house. Multiple houses, the same window, the same night. An entire neighborhood of cameras, blind, not by accident, by design. Whoever came for Nancy Guthrie that night did not stumble into a dark house hoping for the best. They cut the lights first. They knew which utility infrastructure to target. They knew which cameras to disable. They knew exactly how long they had. That is not a crime of opportunity. That is a plan executed by someone who had been preparing for this night for a long time. On February 10th, the FBI released what they had managed to recover from the residual memory inside Nancy's doorbell system. Footage pulled from Google's back-end systems after the physical camera had already been removed from the property. What that footage showed became one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the case. An armed individual, a flashlight held in the mouth, hands-free, occupation-specific behavior that analysts noted points toward someone with a professional background that requires both hands in tight spaces. A gun in a front holster, a gloved hand placed directly over the camera lens, then a nearby shrub used to further conceal the device. A black 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack, the kind sold exclusively at Walmart, confirmed by FBI forensic analysis. Approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10. Average build. He knew exactly where that camera was mounted. He covered it without hesitating. He came to that house knowing its layout, knowing its blind spots, knowing its rhythms. And it turns out he had been there before. A neighbor who regularly walked with Nancy told investigators she spotted a suspicious man near the home around January 11th, 3 weeks before the disappearance. He wore a baseball cap pulled low. He was hunched over. He was looking around the neighborhood in a way that simply did not fit. The slow, deliberate attention of someone studying a location rather than passing through it. When investigators canvassed the area on March 5th, they specifically requested surveillance footage from January 11th. They did not explain publicly why, but the specificity of that date request, weeks into the investigation, focused on a date 3 weeks before the abduction, suggests they had already identified something connecting that date to the night Nancy was taken. 3 weeks. He watched that house for 3 weeks. He learned when Nancy left and when she came home, who drove her, what time the lights went off. He was building a map of her life, and she had no idea. When deputies entered Nancy's home, the interior was largely undisturbed. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass inside, no signs of a prolonged struggle. But on the front porch, there was blood. DNA confirmed it was Nancy's. A forensic analyst examining the blood pattern noted the absence of disruption in the spatter. No voids where footsteps would appear if someone had walked through the scene. The pattern was consistent with blood falling from a stationary or slowly moving source directly above. The interpretation that emerged from that analysis: Nancy may have been carried rather than walking. She was likely incapacitated before she was removed from the property. She did not walk out of that house. She was taken out of it. The forensic trail extended beyond the property. A black glove recovered approximately 2 miles away produced an unknown male DNA profile. No match in the National CODIS database. That DNA did not match a separate unknown profile recovered from inside the house, raising the possibility that more than one person was involved in what happened that night. The glove DNA was later traced to a restaurant worker unrelated to the case. Other evidence collected during the investigation is still being processed. The science is still running. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie did not call the family. They called the media. Ransom demands arrived at local Tucson television stations and at TMZ, $6 million in Bitcoin. 2 deadlines set and allowed to pass without consequence. When no payment came, a second message arrived demanding different cryptocurrency. What made the notes credible in the eyes of investigators was their specificity. The writer referenced Nancy's Apple Watch, a floodlight positioned near her home, the exact clothing she had worn to dinner that evening, details that had never been released publicly, details that only someone with direct knowledge of the crime could know. A retired FBI analyst noted that the writer used the term USD when referencing money, an abbreviation Americans rarely use in casual writing, raising the possibility the author may not be American or was deliberately constructing language designed to obscure their identity. Then the messages stopped. No further contact, no proof of life. Savannah Guthrie stood in front of a camera alongside Annie and Cameron and said directly to whoever was watching, "We received your message. We understand. We are ready to listen." A daughter, one of the most recognized faces on American television, publicly appealing to the person who took her mother to simply make contact. If you are a parent watching this right now, you already understand what that moment cost her. There is one more element of the timeline that has not received enough attention in the public conversation around the Nancy Guthrie case, and it matters specifically in the context of who knew what and when. The ransom notes that arrived at local television stations and at TMZ contained details that had never been made public. Nancy's Apple Watch, a floodlight positioned near her home, the exact clothing she had worn to dinner on the evening of January 31st. The exact clothing she had worn to dinner. Think about who knew what Nancy was wearing that night. Not in a general sense. Not the kind of knowledge you get from a photograph or a public appearance. The specific clothing she had on when she sat at the dinner table, when she played board games with her family, when she said goodnight and got into the car for the short drive home. That is the kind of detail that only a person present at that dinner could provide. The ransom notes are presented in this investigation as evidence of an outside perpetrator, and they may be exactly that. But the specific details they contain, details only someone with direct knowledge of the evening could accurately describe, are among the most analytically interesting elements of this entire case. They either confirm that the perpetrator had independent access to information about that evening, or they raise a question about the source of the information the notes were built from. Investigators noted that the notes used the term USD when referencing money, a phrasing that analysts flagged as unusual for an American writer. The suggestion that the author may not be American, or may have been deliberately constructing language to obscure their identity, is one interpretation. Another interpretation is that a person writing to create the appearance of an outside, foreign-connected perpetrator might deliberately adopt linguistic patterns designed to suggest non-American origin. Both interpretations are possible. Both are consistent with the documented evidence, and both point back to the same underlying question that the phone call, the timeline, and the 41 minutes of confident presence inside the residence all converge on. Who had the knowledge to build what was built here, and when did they acquire it? Let us examine what the investigative record shows about the specific details that make the timeline so analytically significant, not as accusation, but as the documented sequence of events that any serious investigation must account for. The garage door closed at 9:50 p.m. The call was made, and for the next 4 hours, the digital record around Nancy Guthrie's home was quiet. No outgoing calls from her phone, no messages, no activity suggesting anything other than a woman who had come home from a family dinner and gone about the quiet business of ending her evening. Then the pattern changed. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., motion was detected, but nothing was recorded, because Nancy had never subscribed to the storage service that would have saved it. At 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker signal went silent. 16 minutes. Between the motion detected outside at 2:12 and the pacemaker going dark at 2:28. 16 minutes that account for the documented 41 minutes of presence inside the residence differently than the public narrative initially suggested, because the 41-minute figure represents the total documented presence, not necessarily the full operational window. The pacemaker detail is worth sitting with specifically. That device was designed to transmit continuously. It monitored heart function and sent data to an application remotely. The signal went silent at 2:28 a.m. Whether that silence represents a disruption of the transmission signal, a physical distancing of the device from its connected phone, or something else is a question the investigation has been working to answer since the first days. What investigators know is that Nancy's phone was still inside the house when they arrived. Her medication was still there, her wallet, her keys. None of the items a person takes when they leave voluntarily were missing. The only thing missing was Nancy herself. The behavioral analysis of the person on the porch footage has been extensive and consistent across multiple independent analysts. The approach to the camera was direct. No hesitation, no orientation. No the brief pause of someone encountering an unfamiliar installation for the first time. The posture throughout reflected what behavioral analysts call ownership behavior, the subconscious physical confidence of someone who has been in a space many times before. The camera was covered without searching for it. The plant was used to further obscure the lens without hesitation. These are the physical behaviors of someone who already knew exactly where everything was. That specific familiarity, documented in 44 seconds of recovered footage, is the thread that connects the behavioral evidence to the question of who had the prior knowledge this operation required. A stranger studying a house from the street can learn a great deal: the camera position, the approach angle, the general layout of the property. But the confidence visible in those 44 seconds is not the confidence of someone who learned a camera position from the street. It is the confidence of someone who has stood on that porch before, in a different context, and whose body already knows the space. That is what the footage shows. That is what investigators were working from when they elevated the phone call above everything else in the file. Not accusation, not conclusion, investigation. The documented logic of what the evidence points toward before the clearance answers the question. The clearance came. The investigation continues with its focus on an external suspect. And the phone call, whatever it contained, remains the single item that investigators placed at the top of everything else. Whatever was said between Nancy Guthrie and the last person to see her alive, in those quiet minutes after the garage door closed, it mattered to the people whose job was to understand what happened next. Now let us bring this back to where the investigation has been focused and why the phone call matters specifically in this context. Investigators examining the Nancy Guthrie case have operated from a consistent framework throughout. This was not a random crime. The evidence does not support it. 3 weeks of reconnaissance. Knowledge of the utility infrastructure sufficient to blind a neighborhood. Knowledge of the specific camera system at the property, including the fact that Nancy did not have an active Nest subscription. Knowledge of the interior layout sufficient to move through the house in complete darkness without creating a prolonged struggle. Knowledge of Nancy's routine specific enough to time the approach to a Saturday night when her family had just dropped her off after an evening together. None of that knowledge is available to a stranger. All of it is available to someone embedded in the structure of the family's daily life. Someone who knew what Nancy's Saturday evenings looked like. Someone who knew who drove her home. Someone who knew, because they were there, what time the garage door closed and what Nancy was wearing and what kind of watch she had on her wrist. The phone call sits at the intersection of all of those questions. Because the last conversation Nancy had before the window opened, before the cameras went dark and the neighborhood went blind and the pacemaker went silent, was with the person who had just watched her walk through her front door. The person who had been part of this family since 2006. The person who knew this home, its layout, its systems, its rhythms, in the way that only years of regular presence can produce. Law enforcement cleared the Guthrie family. That clearance is official and it was issued with the confidence of investigators who had reviewed the evidence. We are not contradicting it. We are examining the documented logic that preceded it, the investigative focus that the evidence produced before that clearance was announced, and what the publicly confirmed details of the timeline tell us about why that call was elevated above everything else. The 4-hour window remains the most carefully analyzed period in this investigation. What happened between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m., between the garage door closing and the pacemaker going silent, is the question that every piece of evidence is pointed toward answering. A neighbor who observed suspicious activity near the home 3 weeks before the disappearance. A utility box damaged with specific enough knowledge to blind a neighborhood of cameras. A masked individual who approached a camera without hesitation and covered it without searching. 41 minutes of documented presence inside the residence. Enough time, as behavioral analysts have noted, to reflect familiarity with the space. Blood evidence consistent with someone being carried rather than walking. A ransom note containing details that had never been made public. These are not the elements of a random crime of opportunity. They are the elements of something built over time by someone who had the access, the knowledge, and the motivation to build it. The investigation has been clear about one thing since early in the process. This was planned. Not improvised in the moment. Not opportunistic. Planned. The 3 weeks of documented reconnaissance prior to February 1st, the utility infrastructure targeted with sufficient knowledge to blind a neighborhood of cameras simultaneously. The approach to the doorbell camera that reflected prior knowledge of its position. The 41 minutes spent inside the residence with a confidence that behavioral analysts have consistently described as reflecting familiarity rather than first-time intrusion. All of that planning required a starting point, an initial piece of knowledge that made the rest of the planning possible, something that answered the question, why this house? Why this woman? Why this night? For a stranger constructing a financial operation targeting Savannah Guthrie's family, the starting point might be public information. Savannah's prominence, the inference that her family lives in Tucson, a search for an accessible target within that family's circle. That is one possible starting point. For someone with insider access, someone embedded in the family's social and domestic life, the starting point is different. It is specific knowledge that does not need to be researched because it is already known. The house, the routines, the security systems, the medications, the schedule, the nights when Nancy would be alone and the nights when family members would be nearby. The specific Saturday when a family dinner would end and a son-in-law would drop her off and drive away, and there would be 4 hours of quiet before Sunday morning. That kind of knowledge is not researched. It is lived. It is accumulated through years of presence, through dinners and board games and Christmas photos and the ordinary rhythms of a family that stays close. The phone call that investigators elevated above every other piece of evidence in this case exists at the intersection of all of those questions. It is the last documented conversation between Nancy Guthrie and the last person to see her alive. It happened in the window, before the cameras went dark, before the neighborhood went blind, before the pacemaker went silent. Whatever was said in that call, investigators found it significant enough to make it the top item in the investigative file. That is the documented fact. The rest, what it contained, what it revealed, what it confirmed or contradicted, is in the hands of the investigation. The investigation that, officially, cleared the entire Guthrie family. The investigation that, officially, is focused on an external suspect. The investigation that has produced confirmed DNA from inside the residence, a partial profile from a glove found 2 miles away, a Walmart evidence trail, and a forensic genealogy pathway that experts say could produce an identification in minutes to days once the technology gap is closed. The investigation continues. The FBI's Tucson command post remains operational, with personnel being rotated to keep fresh eyes on the evidence. The leads have not been exhausted. The science is not finished. The forensic genealogy pathway, described by leading expert C.C. Moore of Parabon Nanolabs as capable of producing an identification in minutes to days once a viable DNA profile is extracted, remains an active investigative tool being developed with urgency. A retired FBI agent described the most likely path to resolution in a case like this as a person close to the suspect deciding that their conscience outweighs their loyalty. A family member, a friend, a partner, someone who knows something, someone who has been carrying the weight of what they know and is looking for a reason to put it down. That person, if they exist, has a number to call. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Tips can also be submitted at tips.fbi.gov. The Pima County Sheriff's tip line is 520-351-4900. Anonymous tips can be submitted to Tucson Crime Stoppers. The combined reward for information leading to Nancy's safe return or the arrest of those responsible now exceeds $1,200,000. Someone knows what happened on the night of January 31st into the early hours of February 1st, 2026. Someone knows where Nancy Guthrie is. The phone call is in the record. The surveillance footage is in the record. The blood evidence is in the record. The DNA is in the laboratory. The 4-hour window is documented to the minute. Nancy's phone is still on the counter where she left it. Her medication is still where she placed it before leaving for a family dinner she never came home from. A woman who spent 50 years building a life in Tucson, who raised her children alone, who never missed a Sunday service, who was so woven into the fabric of her community that her friends noticed her absence before the police did, is still out there. Her family is still waiting. And somewhere, someone knows exactly where she is. All analysis in this video is based on official law enforcement statements, publicly confirmed investigative reporting from credible news organizations, and verified forensic analysis. All individuals referenced are presumed innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. No individual is named as a suspect in this video. The investigative focus described represents documented reporting of law enforcement activity, not editorial accusation. If this investigation moved you, if this kind of serious, evidence-based documentary investigation is what you come here for, subscribe to the Verdict Room right now and hit that notification bell. Every week we examine the evidence, follow the facts, and deliver the verdict. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What does the timeline tell you? What do you think investigators found in that phone call? This is a community built on serious analysis. Let us hear your perspective. This is the Verdict Room. The evidence has spoken. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. The official position of the Pima County Sheriff's Department is that the Guthrie family, including Tommaso Cioni, was cleared as suspects in this case. Sheriff Nano stated publicly that the family cooperated fully, providing phones, computers, vehicles, and access to their properties. He said they should be treated as victims. That clearance is not a rumor. It is an official law enforcement statement delivered on the record. What is also on the record is a separate pattern of investigative activity. Investigators returned to Annie and Tommaso's property multiple times. They examined the septic system. They impounded Annie's vehicle for forensic processing. They removed security cameras from the property. They interviewed neighbors specifically about the couple. These are documented investigative actions reported by credentialed journalists with named and unnamed sources inside the investigation. Both of these things are simultaneously true. A family can be cleared and still have been the subject of intensive early investigative scrutiny, because that scrutiny is how the clearance is reached. You investigate. You process the evidence. You reach a conclusion. The intensity of the early investigative focus on the family is not inconsistent with the clearance. It is the mechanism by which the clearance was earned. What we do not know, because it has not been made public, is exactly what the investigators found, or did not find, in the course of that scrutiny, what the impounded vehicle contained, or did not contain, what the septic examination produced, what the neighbor interviews established, the specific content of the elevated phone call. What combination of evidence and evidence absence led investigators to conclude, officially and publicly, that the family was clear? Those answers are in the investigation. They are not in the public record. And until they are, the documented logic of the timeline, the phone call, the 4-hour window, the knowledge embedded in the ransom notes, the behavioral evidence of familiarity on the porch, remains part of the picture that serious analysis cannot set aside. The verdict, when it comes, will belong to the evidence, not to theories, not to timelines, not to behavioral analysis, to the DNA in the laboratory, the cell tower data being cross-referenced, the forensic genealogy work being built specifically because of this case. That is where the answer lives, and that is where this investigation is heading, one breakthrough at a time. There is a dimension of this case that deserves direct attention before we close. The question of what the complete absence of proof of life means for the ransom narrative. Professional kidnapping operations, operations genuinely motivated by financial extraction, are built around a fundamental transaction: The family pays. The captors return the victim. For that transaction to function, the captors must demonstrate that they actually have the victim. They must provide proof of life, specific details, personal information that only someone with direct access to the victim could know, proof that the person is alive and will remain alive if the ransom is paid. The Nancy Guthrie ransom communications did not provide acceptable proof of life. No recorded message from Nancy. No personal information that only she could supply in a live interaction. No ongoing contact that maintained family compliance and negotiating pressure. 2 deadlines passed without follow-through. Communication became erratic rather than systematic. Former FBI agents who analyzed these communications for news outlets noted consistently that this pattern does not reflect how professional ransom operations function. Professional kidnappers communicate aggressively and consistently because payment is the goal. The victim is the asset. You do not let the deadlines pass. You do not go silent. You maintain the pressure. What the communication pattern does reflect, and what several law enforcement analysts stated publicly in the context of this case, is the behavioral signature of ransom communications designed to create the appearance of a kidnapping rather than to execute one. Theater, not transaction. Communications built to shape the investigative narrative in a specific direction, not to produce a payment. That is one analytical interpretation. It is not the only one. An inexperienced perpetrator who overestimated their operational capability and panicked when the pressure of a national investigation exceeded what they had prepared for could also produce this pattern. Both explanations exist in the investigative literature for cases like this. But the combination, the specific insider knowledge in the notes, the erratic communication, the absence of proof of life, and the total silence of the Bitcoin wallet that the FBI has been watching around the clock, creates a picture that does not resolve cleanly into a single narrative. It raises questions. It demands answers. And it points back, as every other element of this case eventually does, to the fundamental question of motive. Why Nancy Guthrie? Why that house? Why that night? Why the specific knowledge embedded in those notes? The investigation is working toward those answers. The evidence will eventually produce them. And when it does, every element of the timeline, including the phone call that investigators elevated above everything else, will be part of the picture that explains how this happened. Nancy Guthrie deserves that picture to be complete. The answer is still out there. The investigation is still active. The evidence is still in the laboratory. And the phone call, whatever it contained, is still in the record. This is the verdict room. We examine the evidence. We follow the facts. And at the end of every investigation, we deliver the verdict. Subscribe right now if you are not already part of this community, and hit that notification bell. Every week, we go further than the headlines. We ask the questions that need to be asked. We follow the evidence wherever it leads. The evidence is spoken. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. 67 days, and counting, of the most resource-intensive missing persons investigation in recent American history. Federal agents, multi-agency coordination, a command post that has remained operational through multiple rotations of personnel, forensic genealogy experts standing by, DNA in multiple laboratories, a Walmart evidence trail being worked, cell tower data being analyzed, January 11th footage being sought. All of that pointed at a single answer, one name, one person responsible for what happened in the 4-hour window between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m. on the night of January 31st into February 1st, 2026. The phone call is in the record, the timeline is documented, the evidence is in the laboratory, the answer is coming.